Hi students, welcome to the Lesson 5 lecture on populism and the beginnings of U.S. imperialism. I think I'll probably split this into two videos as well. This first video will look at the populist movement in the United States, here in part 1. The populist movement had a lot to do with the growing dissatisfaction among voters with the Democrats and Republicans, the two main parties at the time, and still the two main parties in our political system. These two main political parties stayed in relative balance throughout the late 1800s. Typically, the president would serve one term, and the party that held office would switch each term. In terms of the Electoral College, each state tended to vote the same way in each election. There were only about 5 states that could be swayed either way in an election. Republicans were primarily, carried the northern states. They relied on their legacy of having been the most loyal party to the Union cause during the Civil War. This electoral tactic of reminding voters about the Republican Party's support for the Union cause in the Civil War was known as waving the bloody shirt. If you can imagine the bloody shirt of a Union veteran, politician up on a podium waving it around and reminding people, this is what we fought for. We were there in the trenches when, when we were tested with this ordeal. However, after a while, voters got tired of Republicans harping on the past glories of the Civil War and resting on their laurels. So the Republicans also sought to appeal to Protestant Christians with support for stricter moral legislation, such as laws that restricted alcohol sales. And the Republicans also tended to support higher tariffs and to oppose immigration. On the other hand, the Democrats carried the South, resting on their legacy as being the party of the Confederacy. Even though there were some Northern Democrats, but who were kind of lukewarm about supporting the Union cause in the Civil War because they somewhat sympathized with the Southern Democrats. The main part of the Democratic Party ended up siding, I think it's safe to say, with the Confederacy. The Democrats also opposed moral legislation, opposed tariffs, and supported immigration and Catholic ethnic groups. These are the groups that the mostly Protestant Republicans tended to oppose. However, neither of the two main parties was particularly interested in regulating big businesses, taxing the wealthy, or interfering with the government's overall support of free market policies during the Gilded Age. Many voters were increasingly dissatisfied with the free market policies of the Gilded Age, but not many people were ready to hop on board with their group as radical as the socialists. The populists, however, were just radical enough. The populist philosophy did not object to all private business, like the socialists did, at least in theory. Some socialists weren't quite so extreme, but some were. The populists, however, across the board, only objected to concentrated big business. They didn't object to small businesses or farmers working their own land. They didn't call for the government to run, all of that or nationalize agricultural production or anything of that sort. So for that reason, farmers or small businessmen who employed a few people could feel much more at home in the populist movement than in the socialist movement, because the socialist movement would have labeled them as capitalists, maybe small-time capitalists, but still capitalists, and thus kind of the enemy or the opponent of wage workers. Another reason for the interest in the populist movement was the huge amount of corruption in the two main parties. For the most part, politics were controlled by the party bosses, who were almost like mafia bosses. They made private deals with businesses, unions, ethnic groups, and other special interest groups in order to secure their votes and support for the candidates that the party bosses selected. In return, a business might hope to get a special subsidy for them written into a piece of legislation. A union or ethnic group might hope to get its workers hired onto government payroll or special projects. And if you were a candidate that was seeking elected office, you would be wise to affiliate yourself with one of these party bosses who would use their clout to rally the necessary votes for your election. However, once this party boss got you elected, you were indebted to him throughout your time in office, and you had to protect the party boss's reputation by delivering the goods to the special interest groups that the party boss had rallied behind you, regardless of what the overall interests of the entire country or constituency might call for. This corrupt way of doing politics meant that the two main parties drifted farther and farther away from having any sort of coherent opposing ideologies and closer towards having the same default pro-free market philosophy, just with a different grab bag of special interest groups that each party had chosen to serve. Any voters who were unlucky enough to find themselves outside of either party's collection of special interest groups felt like they had no meaningful choices when picking between Democrats and Republicans. And by the way, back in like the elections in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, Ralph Nader, the Green Party candidate, used to complain about the same thing. He used to say that the Democrats and Republicans were like Tweedledee and Tweedledum. That's what he used to call them. But people were already complaining about this back in the Gilded Age in the late 1800s. The Pendleton Civil Service Act was passed in 1883 in order to make more federal job hiring be based on standardized tests and merit rather than personal connections. However, many voters thought that this was not enough to address corruption. So voters began to flock to the new Populist Party in the 1890s. Some people even began to wonder whether the Democratic Party would be replaced by this new Populist Party as the second main major party, as this following cartoon from the time period suggests, where you have the Populist Party here as the snake. Looks like this is supposed to be William Jennings Bryan, as my guess, swallowing the Democratic Party. Because there was some overlap between the two platforms, as we'll see. And the natural alternative choice for a lot of people in the Democratic Party at the time would have been the Populist Party. Even though the People's Party or the Populist Party never won a presidential election, their limited success in winning seats at local and state levels helped keep the two major parties honest and forced the Democrats and Republicans to govern less corruptly later during the Progressive era. Otherwise, the Populist Party would just keep taking more and more of their votes. So how is the populist movement organized? The populist movement started to gain momentum mainly among farmers who were experiencing economic problems in the South and West. Those problems included reliance on monoculture cash crops, meaning farmers grew only one crop, usually wheat, cotton, or corn. So they had no alternative crops to sell if crops failed or got low prices. Crops were sold on international markets, so farmers depended on volatile international prices for income. Farmers were dependent on middlemen who could charge high storage and freight rates. Farmers were dependent on railroads to transport their crops. Railroads charged high freight rates. That's one of those middlemen, right? The national shortage of money during the Gilded Age meant that farmers had to rely on credit, on very high interest mortgages in the West where they needed to buy land, because at this point all the free land had been settled. So you had to buy land from someone who had already settled it, or from a railroad company that had bought up a bunch of it, as was often the case. And in the South, they oftentimes went into debt under what was called the crop lien system, which was a system putting up next year's expected harvest as collateral for a loan. And these tended to have very high interest rates as well. And also, high tariffs on imported goods and materials increased the cost of basic farm supplies for farmers. So farmers were dealing with all of these problems out in the West and in the South in the late 1800s. So how did they address it? First was this network of populist organizations that they called the Grange. Kind of a weird word, but this is what they called it. It was basically a social and self-help network which promoted cooperatives in the 1870s. These farmers' cooperatives built things like collective storage silos and helped farmers become less reliant on middlemen. These cooperatives also helped farmers negotiate as a larger group with railroad companies. Then came another network called the Farmers Alliances. These alliances began with farmers' clubs formed in Texas in the late 1870s. Like the Grange, the alliances formed cooperatives to provide farmers with loans, credit, retail stores, silos, and negotiating representatives. Neighborhood chapters were called sub-alliances. Lecturers were hired and trained to give lectures on national issues. The farmers' alliances even published their own alliance newspapers. All the farmers' alliances in the South united to become the Southern Alliance with 1 million members by 1890. So really a mass movement. And these farmers' alliances were not directly affiliated with either major party. They didn't really feel at home in either of the two main parties at the time. So they started looking around and thought, well, we should form our own political coalition and form our own political party to run for office. Not just farmers' cooperatives and whatnot, but let's actually run for office and change policies. So they started assembling a coalition. Racism in the South prevented whites from allowing blacks to join, so blacks formed the Colored Farmers National Alliance, but there was some cooperation with the local white sub-alliances. Neither side really trusted each other too much, but they made some tactical agreements to say, look, we're both on the same side of this or that struggle. So there was some cooperation. Women were a big part of the alliances. They made up a fourth of the membership. They had full voting membership, and many held office, wrote articles, or were employed as lecturers. Mary Elizabeth Lease was the most famous of these female lecturers. Her nickname was the populist Joan of Arc. And this was a time period when politics was not really considered a proper activity for women to engage in. It was seen as rough and vulgar and kind of somewhat sleazy endeavor. Well, especially with the two major parties being so corrupt, they made it that way. So to see women getting involved like this was a new thing. In 1889, the state alliances of North and South Dakota and Kansas joined the Southern Alliance to form the National Farmers Alliance and Industrial Union. Their goal was to create a large enough political pressure group to influence politicians to pass favorable legislation. They began in 1890 with the off-year elections, and they had great success in their state legislatures and elected supporters as 6 governors, 3 U.S. senators, and 44 U.S. representatives. They were so successful that the alliance decided to form a third party. At a convention called in 1892 in Omaha, Nebraska, they created a third party, the People's Party, also oftentimes called the Populist Party. 1,300 delegates were present, including 100 delegates from the Black Alliance, delegates from the Knights of Labor, and delegates from the women's movement. These people were the foundation of the Populist Coalition. The demands of the Populist Party's Omaha platform that they agreed to in 1892 included the formation of sub-treasuries, which were going to be these government-supervised warehouses that would store crops for farmers as collateral for a low-interest loan from the government until international prices rose high enough for the sale of the crop to pay off the loan and give the farmer a profit. So this was the way of a farmer getting short-term cash and not having to sell when prices were low, kind of a way of evening out their income. And the U.S. government actually does a similar thing nowadays with the farm subsidies and insurance that it gives to farmers to insure their crops, against bad weather and things of that sort, to keep their income more stable. The Populists also proposed government ownership of railroads, telegraphs, and telephone lines so that freight rates and other charges would be kept fair and reasonable. It was hard to rely on the free market to make sure that the prices of these things would remain low because there wasn't really a lot of competition in these areas. These were things that were called natural monopolies, meaning there's really it only really makes sense to build one railroad line or one telephone line in an area. It's a lot more infrastructure to have to build redundant lines It's kind of like, should your house have multiple sewer lines, one owned by city utilities and the other owned by uh, Springfield Sewer Company, and then each month you can switch in between the two depending on which one you want to use and pay for sewer service? No, that doesn't make sense. Um, Populists also proposed the prohibition of foreign and absentee land ownership so that profits remain in the community and land ownership remained in the community. They proposed to reform the money supply. This reform of the money supply was probably the biggest part of the populist platform, the one that they focused on the most. And the reason why it was so important to people is it really determined how easy it was to get a loan and how hard things were for debtors, people who were in debt. An expansion of the money supply would make things easier on debtors, make things harder on creditors. Okay, easier on debtors because money would be more plentiful, loans would be more plentiful, and prices would rise. So it'd be easier to pay off loans. It'd be bad for creditors if prices rose because then your money isn't worth as much. Your dollar doesn't go as far. So if you're getting paid back in dollars, it's not going to be worth as much as you expected it to be. So let me explain too the way the monetary system worked at the time. The U.S. was at this point under the gold standard, which meant that basically any citizen could theoretically show up at the federal offices of the U.S. Mint with 1 ounce of gold and give the U.S. Mint 1 ounce of gold in exchange for $20.67 in paper legal tender dollars. So you give them 1 ounce of gold, they give you $20.67, and then you go use that $20.67. That circulates around the economy. People could also reverse the transaction and take $20.67 to the U.S. Mint and exchange it for 1 gold ounce. The populists wanted what they called free and unlimited minting of silver coins to increase the money supply at a 16-to-1 ratio with gold. What this meant was a citizen would now be able to bring either 1 ounce of gold or 16 ounces of silver to the U.S. Mint and receive $20.67 in paper dollars in return, or redeem those $20.67 and be paid in either 1 ounce of gold or 16 ounces of silver. The 16-to-1 ratio was proposed because silver was known to be much more plentiful than gold, and if it had been something like a 1-to-1 ratio, then there would have been way too many people showing up with silver. There would have been way too many dollars created, with all the silver that would have been brought to the treasury. So this new 16-to-1 bimetallism standard aimed to moderately increase the number of dollars in circulation and increase the amount of money available for loans. However, some populists were even more ambitious. They were called greenbackers because they wanted the federal government to be able to issue an unlimited number of greenbacks, what we would call just our modern-day paper dollar bills, without needing any gold or silver in exchange whatsoever, without needing to bring gold or silver to the U.S. Mint. The U.S. Mint would just be printing these paper dollars and be, giving them out however much they wanted. Most people at the time thought that this was going too far and would make paper dollars worthless, so this never quite caught on though. But some people jumped on board the free silver thing, which was seen as kind of a compromise. Populists also wanted banking reform in general. They wanted the ability to establish postal savings banks, where you could, instead of having to rely on private banks to store your savings, you could go to the post office and open up a checking account there, basically. And the government would store your money for you. You noticed a lot of faith in government during this time period. Much more faith in government, really, than even in private business, especially big business. That's something that is different in that time period from what you'll see among a lot of farmers today, oddly enough. Another thing the populists called for was greater direct democracy in government. So, for example, things such as the initiative, a process where citizens write a bill and get signatures to force politicians to vote on it. And the referendum, where citizens petition politicians to send a bill to the people to vote on it. And then popular direct election of U.S. senators, rather than the existing system where senators were chosen by each state legislature, which is how it was originally done under the Constitution. Now, it wouldn't be until the Progressive era that this was changed, but the populists were already calling for it in the late 1890s, about 10 years before the Progressive era. The populists also wanted secret ballots. They also wanted a one-term restriction for presidents, I guess to try to decrease corruption, so presidents can just follow their conscience and not have to worry about being reelected and have to make all sorts of deals to do that. And also to get industrial workers into their coalition, the Populist Party proposed outlawing private security guard firms like the Pinkerton detective agency, what were called private armies at the time. The Populists proposed an 8-hour workday standard and also immigration restrictions. So the Populist Party competed in the 1892 elections under this platform. They nominated James B. Weaver as their presidential candidate, and he got 8.5% of the votes nationwide. 1,500 populists were elected in state legislatures, 3 governors, 5 senators, 10 representatives in Congress. An excellent start for a brand new party, huh? I would say so. In the 1896 elections, the populists were initially the only party that supported free silver, the switch to the bimetallism standard instead of staying with the gold standard. But then the Democratic Convention adopted the same free silver platform and chose William Jennings Bryan as their presidential candidate after he made his stunning Cross of Gold speech. So now the populists had a real conundrum. Do we support William Jennings Bryan? Because, he's embracing part of our platform, at least, the most important part of our platform, as far as we're concerned. Or do we remain more pure and go for everything? Well, the populists decided to compromise, and they decided to support William Jennings Bryan rather than split the vote by running their own third-party candidate. So the populists and the Democrats banded together in a coalition to support William Jennings Bryan in this 1896 election. This coalition was keen to lower the protective tariffs that made European imports more expensive and which encouraged European countries to retaliate with their own tariffs on America's grain exports. The lowering of the protective tariffs would have helped American farmers, right? Because they would have been able to sell more of their grain abroad without those retaliatory tariffs from other countries hitting them. But it might have hurt America's industries with the increased competition from cheap European imports. Business leaders warned that the lowering of the protective tariff was going to lead to a huge loss of sales and would force business owners to cut hundreds of thousands of jobs. Likewise, the media and business leaders claimed that a victory for William Jennings Bryan and his free silver platform would wreck the U.S. economy by undermining creditors' and investors' faith in the value of the dollar, leading to a flight of investor money out of the country and potentially millions of job losses. Workers in the industrial Northeast did not like the sound of that, so enough of them voted for the Republican platform of sound money and protection, as you see on this coin here, in the 1896 election to give the Republican candidate William McKinley the victory. Right here, this guy. The fact that the populists could not get William Jennings Bryan elected, even with the combined support of the Democrats, led to demoralization and a collapse of the Populist Party. But the goals of the populist movement lived on, and many of them eventually came about in later periods of reform, such as during the Progressive Era and the New Deal. All right, we will pick up part 2 with U.S. imperialism.